Welcome to the Crunch McDabble Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles. This is the only show where we break down the Pathfinder 2nd Edition rules. Today's show, Cleric Doctrines. Yeah. When you play a cleric in Pathfinder 2nd Edition and you're making all the choices for your cleric, one of your class features is something called your doctrine. A doctrine is basically a set of beliefs for how a cleric carries out their faith. As the book says, even among followers of the same deity, there are numerous doctrines and beliefs, which sometimes vary wildly between clerics. In other words, you could have two clerics with the same class and even the same deity, and they could look drastically different, just because they have a different doctrine. Does that make sense, everybody? To simplify and to use game terms that don't exist in the game, but that everybody seems to understand, a doctrine is basically a subclass for clerics. Capiche? Capiche. At this point, there are two cleric doctrines. They are the same two doctrines that came out with the core rulebook. They are the Cloistered Cleric and the Warpriest. Let's take a look at all the ins and all the outs and all the working parts here to see how this whole doctrine thing works. First, what makes up a doctrine? When you look at a doctrine, it has two parts. The first up here is the flavor sentence. It's a single sentence describing the doctrine. The Cloistered Cleric doctrine, for example, reads, "You're a cleric of the cloth, focusing on divine magic and your connection to your deity's domains." The Warpriest reads, "You have trained in the more militant doctrine of your church, focusing on both spells and battle." See, it's a single sentence that gives you the flavor of the doctrine. The second part of the doctrine, it's a list of all the things you get and at what level. The levels are levels 1, 3, 7, 11, 15, and 19, and then each of those has a title. The first is called First Doctrine, Second Doctrine, Third Doctrine, Fourth Doctrine, Fifth Doctrine, and finally, my favorite, Final Doctrine. And finally, probably the most important part, it gives you the mechanics for what you get, and these are called benefits. Now, this all seems neat. A cleric has a faith in a deity. That faith is expressed in a set of beliefs called a doctrine. Then, as that cleric advances in levels, those beliefs mature, and the cleric progresses in that doctrine, gaining new benefits as a result. So what is actually in a doctrine mechanically? In other words, what are these benefits? Well, let's take a close look at them. A doctrine affects three proficiencies: your fortitude save, your weapon proficiency, and your spellcasting DC. For the cleric, these three proficiencies don't advance on their own in the class features, and they would just stay at trained proficiency if nothing affected them. The doctrine is the only way these three can advance. So without the doctrine, they would just stay at trained proficiency. And since nothing in the class features ever stays at trained proficiency, it becomes the responsibility of the doctrine to advance these three proficiencies. Doctrines also give a first level class feat that fits the theme of the doctrine. The Cloistered Cleric starts out with the Domain Initiate feat, and the Warpriest starts out with the Deadly Simplicity feat. The Cloistered Cleric focuses on divine magic and the deity's domains, and they get a domain focus spell. And the Warpriest is trained in the more militant doctrines of the church, and they get to increase the damage die of their deity's favored weapon, if it's a simple weapon or if it's unarmed. So that's cool. Now, there are also general feats in doctrines as well. Actually, only one of the doctrines has general feats, but it gets several. The Warpriest gets the Shield Block general feat as part of their benefit in the first doctrine, and then they get the Martial Weapon Proficiency general feat in the second doctrine at third level. These function exactly as if you had just taken the general feat with your general feats. Nothing special there. What that means is your martial weapon proficiency doesn't increase to expert when your other weapon proficiencies increase. The Warpriest will only ever have trained proficiency for most martial weapons, unless their deity's favored weapon is a martial weapon, of course. Finally, the last thing here, and this is maybe the most interesting, the Warpriest adds trained proficiency in light and medium armor in their first doctrine, which is really adding two general feats in one when it gets down to it. It's a light and a medium armor proficiency. But it's even better than that because they advance to expert proficiency in both of those armors at level 13. This makes it quite a bit better than just getting 2 general feats. In a sense, this is adding or manipulating a class feature, which is nice, and that makes me excited for what else they might play around with in future Cleric Doctrines. I think that's neat. Okay, let's lay these 2 doctrines out side by side and see what they look like. For Fortitude saving throw, a Cloistered Cleric starts out with trained proficiency. They advance to expert proficiency right away at level 3. And by contrast, a Warpriest starts at expert proficiency at level 1 and then advances to master proficiency at level 15. For the Warpriest, the proficiency bump at level 15, it's a little better than just a +2. At level 15, when the Warpriest advances to master proficiency, they also turn successes into critical successes. This is essentially the Juggernaut class feature. Juggernaut is a class feature given exclusively to martial classes, and only the toughest martial classes. Those martial classes get this at varying levels, pretty much based on how tough the class is. Now, the Warpriest getting this at level 15, it's certainly not as fast as a Barbarian that gets it at level 7, or a Monk could get at level 7. But it is faster than some other classes, like the Gunslinger and the Inventor, and the Squishy Rogue. The Rogue doesn't even get it at all. So it's actually a pretty big honor to be the only spellcaster listed here among these giants, or among these tough buggers, or whatever you want to call them. Okay, for spell attack proficiency and DC, a Cloistered Cleric follows the exact same progression as all the other casting classes. They start out at trained proficiency, they advance to expert at level 7, and they advance to master at level 15. And they advance to legendary at level 19, don't forget that. There's no difference there from any other casting class. Now, the Warpriest has this completely unique spellcasting progression. They don't advance to expert proficiency until level 11, and then they advance to master proficiency way up there at level 19. And finally, for weapon proficiency, the Cloistered Cleric advances to expert proficiency with the deity's favored weapon, with unarmed attacks, and with simple weapons at level 11, while the Warpriest advances to expert in these things 4 levels earlier at level 7. For both doctrines, this also includes the weapon's critical specialization effect for the deity's favored weapon only. The critical specialization effect is nice, but not entirely unique. Certainly not as unique as the Juggernaut class feature. Most martial classes get this in some form or another at various levels and under various conditions. The Ranger, for example, gets it against their hunted prey. Or rogues get it against flat-footed targets. So if you're like me, how often are you going to forget to add that bonus in? Anyways, even the Bard gets this straight up at level 11 on their weapons. So, it's not, what does that tell you? It's not the most unique thing. A lot of ancestries get this for their ancestral weapon group at level 5. So it's not the most unique thing, but it is kind of interesting. Well, there it is in its entirety. That is everything that goes into a doctrine laid out side by side. So let's soak it in for a second. We'll breathe it in. We'll inhale some Cleric Doctrine. That's nice. What do you see here? What do you see? What do your elven eyes see there, Legolas? The first thing I want to point out here, no other class works like this. Look at this. The Cleric is incredibly unique, and I love that. Every other class has their class features set, and that's the way it is. A Ranger at 9th level has Expert Fortitude, and that's the end of it. A Wizard at 16th level has Master Spellcasting DC, and that's it. It can never get any better, and it can never get any worse. The Cleric's Fortitude save, their Spell DC, and their weapon proficiency all change based on their doctrine, which means there is potentially an endless amount of possible class features for the Cleric. What that means is you could make an actual martial Cleric out of a casting class. The Cleric is the only spellcaster so far that has the door left open for this as a possibility. See, because you could set these levers as potentially anything, look what you could do. And I emphasize could. We're just theorizing right now at what could come down the road. So let's design a purely theoretical Cleric Doctrine. We will call it the Divine Ordinance. We will give it the flavor sentence, you train rigorously with your deity's favored weapon at the expense of your spellcasting. Now, Fortitude, we're going to dump that one. And then Spell DC, we're going to dump that one too. We set that one just like the Warpriest. Then, for weapon proficiency, and this is only with the deity's favored weapon, we set it just like the Warpriest, except at level 15, we increase it to Master Proficiency. And there it is. Finally, we have a true caster with Master Weapon Proficiency, albeit it's only with the single weapon, with the deity's favored weapon, and they don't get it until 2 levels later than the other martial classes, and they don't start out with the maxed out strength or dexterity like the martials do, and they don't get greater weapon specialization like the martials. But, man, that would be fun. So come on, Paizo, let's get that one done. The biggest problem with this, of course, is all the indignation from the mutagenists, and rightfully so. This would be a pretty good kick in the pants to them. All the mutagenists would cry out in one guttural, mutagenized howl, "No! I'd make that doctrine anyways. I mean, who cares about making the alchemist mad? What are they going to punch my lights out for saying that? They have expert proficiency with their attacks. They probably won't even hit me. Are they going to heal me to death with the elixirs of life? And, are they going to put pop dust on my square? Are they going to get all hopped up on blood eye coffee and then craft me to death? I mean, come on, don't worry about the alchemist. Just make that doctrine." Now, that's all just theoretical and looking forward with the anticipation to what's coming down the road, and that's fun. But getting down to the 2 doctrines that we have now, these proficiency bonuses seem like they are supposed to be similar by comparison when you look at them side by side. In fact, if you add up the total amount of bonus you get from these 3 at each level, you have exactly the same total amount of bonus between the 2 all the way through, except at level 1 and 2, where the Warpriest starts out with that expert fortitude save. Also, you can see here at levels 3, 4, 5, and 6, and again at level 11, 12, 13, and 14, the bonuses are exactly the same. Just pointing that out. For the most part, these doctrines are pretty much what you would expect just from reading their description. The Cloistered Cleric is a spellcasting cleric, and the Warpriest is a warrior type of cleric. However, let's see if that's actually true. If we compare the average bonuses here, add this all up, and divide by 20, this shows us what these doctrines are good at throughout the leveling process, where they're highest at. And you can see the Cloistered Cleric cracks 4 in spellcasting DC. So that makes sense for them. They want to cast spells and they have a good spellcasting DC. The Warpriest, by contrast, doesn't even crack 4 with their weapon DC. In fact, they barely reach 3.5. But look what they do have. They have that huge fortitude save by comparison. They actually have a higher average bonus in their fortitude save at 4.6 than the Cloistered Cleric spell DC at 4.2. In fact, 4.6 is the highest average bonus here. And that doesn't even take into account the impact of Juggernaut after level 15. So the conclusion I get from this, the Warpriest isn't so much spec'd out for war as much as they're spec'd out for defense and survivability. They get fortitude, they get armor proficiency, and they get shield blocks. So war for them means, being able to take a hit and being able to shrug off poison. I guess if that's what you mean by war, that's what they got. Now here is the big burning question, and really the only important question when it comes down to it. Which of these is better? In other words, if I were to take a Warpriest and a Cloistered Cleric and throw them in some magically sealed arena and lock the exit, who would walk out and who gets carried out on a stretcher or on a shield or whatever? Well, the Cloistered Cleric really lends itself well to making a casting type of cleric type of build. If you max out wisdom and max out charisma, which is perfectly reasonable with this build, and just try and hang in the back here in what we'll call the caster pocket back here, you're going to do really well. You have the maxed out spell DCs that match all the other casters, and with your divine font, you're actually going to have more max level spells than any other class, even the sorcerer. Now, more than half of those spells are going to be heal or harm spells, but that's a pretty legit spell, especially because we can use feats to weaponize our harm spells and obliterate things with negative energy. With the feat's Harming Hands, Versatile Font, Directed Channel, and Selective Energy, you can burst out 3 action max level harm spells in a 60-foot cone, which is massive, and deal a d10 per spell level to everything in that area, and avoid your allies on top of that. And you can do that 8 times a day at level 5, and then 9 times a day at level 15. I mean, how do you like me now? Warpriest is a little different. You have a little better armor class, and you have the shield block reaction, so this guy isn't afraid to get up close to the enemy. This changes things a little bit for you. If you get adjacent to an enemy, you can use a single action harm spell, which is going to deal the same amount of damage as a 2-action harm spell. See, when you're using these harm spells to harm a creature, the only thing you're getting for that extra action is more range. But since you have the defense, you can get up close and then save that action. Just use the single action version. This means you can follow that single action harm spell up with a melee attack and still have an action left over to raise your shield. So that right there, that is your 3-action bread and butter combo. Let it get to room temperature, spread evenly, and enjoy. And look at the cleric feats that complement this 3-action combo. Harming Hands is going to turn those D8 single action touch harm spells into D10 single action touch harm spells. Sap Life at level 2 is going to give you hit points back for no cost at all, not even an action. Divine Weapon at level 6 is going to add an extra die of damage, again as a free action just for casting a spell that we're planning on casting in our routine anyways. Then Emblazoned Energy is going to add another die of elemental damage to our attacks, still with no added actions. So now here at level 8, we're dealing 4d10 negative damage with the touch harm spell. This heals us 4 hit points back, and then we're making an attack at expert proficiency that adds 2 extra die of damage, and the whole time we're keeping our shield raised. That is pretty nasty. It gets better though, because at level 10, with the replenishment of war, if our weapon attack hits, we get temporary hit points. Again, still not adding any actions in. And then at level 14, the Extend Armament feat adds in another bonus die of damage for just 1 action per combat for the whole combat. It's like entering a stance almost. That's a 3rd extra die of damage for our weapon strikes, and we get temporary hit points back, and we aren't adding in any actions each round. That extra damage, to me, that looks like, even though it's only D4s and sometimes it's going to be D6s, it's kind of like adding a poor man's equivalent of a sneak attack or a finishing move or something like that, but it's coming through in our divine power, which I think is really fun. Well, there you go. I don't know which is better. I mean, obviously it's the Warpriest, but I don't know. I think what this shows is true to what they said. The two clerics of the same deity could look drastically different based on their doctrine. And that is it. I've been your host, Crunch McDabbles. This has been the Crunch McDabbles Show. Survive Galarian with the Cleric Doctrine that's got just the right amount of fortitude saving throw for you. Remember to be fast and be to the point. That's what people want to hear. Quick, to the point YouTube videos. Well, that and some really overpowered sound effects. That's what people seem to like. Loud, jumpy sound effect. So the biggest problem with this, of course, is all the indignation. Is all the indignation. So come on, Paizo, let's get that one done. I built the whole thing for you. All you got to do is slap it in one of your books. Come on, get her done. Come on. That's such brilliant writing. Who writes this thing? So good.